Hi, I'm Aisha Wilson-Carter. I'm the Executive Director for Equity and Inclusion. So as people are coming in, I don't know about you, but I'm very, very excited for today's program, Identity and Politics. So I just want to start out, before we get started, just thanking a couple of people. I'm going to thank everyone who helps to make these programs possible. So we have, obviously, Athleen Collins and her great team at the Cultural Center, also AV, we have food services, we also have our marketing team, we have our program administrator in our office, Manish Saheed. So I do want to thank everybody for coming together and collaborating on this. So I also want to thank the Provost's office and the President's office, of course. So what excites me most about today's program is really that we have some of our best scholars from all across the university and representing all different disciplines here to share their perspectives and expertise about this historic election cycle. So we're really excited to bring this program to you. And I do want to thank all of our panelists today that have been willing to share and collaborate on this event. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the one and only, our Vice President of Equity Inclusion, Dr. Cornell Craig.
All right. Good afternoon. So I'm just going to give you just a kind of a overview of what we have today. We have two panels, which we'll have. This will be the first, and then we'll have a second one. This first one looking at women's voices in politics. The birth of these two sessions, these two conversations that we'll have today, really were established in the summer during some conversations that we were having in the Office of Equity and Inclusion, looking at the changing demographics, not only, of course, in higher education that we always talk about within our space, but also the changing demographics within the United States and how that impacts the electorate. So that's what we hope to engage in today, as a robust conversation around how those changes take place within our society. And also understanding that even though we have these overarching titles or labels of identities, that no group is a monolith. And there are different perspectives, different experiences that exist within any category that we use. So without further ado, I will introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Dr. Benita San Pedro is a professor of Spanish Colonial Studies in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature. Her research engages the Spanish colonial past and presence, archives and legacies, both in North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America, and in the Caribbean. She has published extensively on politics and processes of decolonization, colonial archives, colonial domestic labor, and colonial politics of meteorology, the intersections of gender, science, and colonialism, colonial health and biopolitics, colonial deportations and insular carceral systems, and on border mobility and migration. So please welcome our discussion moderator, Dr. Benita San Pedro. Oh, and our entire panel, yes.
All right. So thank you very much for the introduction to the symposium and for the presentation. Welcome everyone to the Fall Symposium on Identity Politics, organized by the Office of Equity and Inclusion at Hofstra University. And of course, I want to acknowledge the work of Aisha Wilson-Carter, the Executive Director for Equity and Inclusion, and of Cornell Craig, the Hofstra's Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, in putting together this panel and many other events to engage the community on pressing contemporary issues. I also want to thank the Hofstra Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins and her colleagues at that office, which basically take care of all of our events on campus. This year's symposium theme is focused on the role of social identities in United States politics. And there will be two panels, as it was mentioned already. This is the first of two, Women's Voices in Politics. It will run until 2:25. And there will be a second panel right after this one in the same room, so you can just stay here, from 2:40 to 4:05. And the second panel will be focused on white male identity in the political landscape. For this panel on women's voices in politics, I have here to my side 5 stellar participants and campus colleagues, 5 great scholars and mentors, which are of immense help to all students and to the campus community. So I will present them in the order we have them on this table. Tricia Green, Professionalism Coordinator and Administrative Assistant to Ellen Perlman and the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Andrea Libresco, Professor of Social Studies Education in the Department of Learning, Teaching and Technology, Director of the Doctoral Program in Learning and Teaching, and Director of the Minor in Civic Engagement and the Institute for Peace Studies. Lisa Merrill, Professor of Performance Studies, Rhetoric and Public Advocacy Program in the Department of Writing Studies and Rhetoric. Tomika Robinson, Senior Associate Dean in the Stuart and Nancy Rabinovitz Honors College and Professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy in the Department of Writing Studies and Rhetoric. And Tanika Smith, Professor of Graduate Nursing at the Hofstra School of Nursing and Physician Assistant Studies. For this panel, we will structure it around 5 or 6 questions that I will formulate to different members of the table, and they will address these questions according to their areas of expertise. And towards the end of the panel, like 15 minutes before we end at 2:05, 2:10, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So the first set of questions is on the history of women in politics in the United States. Unlike many other countries in the Americas, the United States has never elected a woman for the presidency. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in the 2016 election, but did not make it to the White House. But I do want to remind everyone here that we do have several female presidents in Latin America at the moment. Claudia Sheinbaum just took office in Mexico City, in Mexico. Xiomara Castro is the president in Honduras. Dina Boluarte is the president in Peru. And Mia Mottley is the prime minister in Barbados. Of course, Ursula von der Leyen, on the other side of the Atlantic, is also the president of the European Commission. So I want to address this first question to 3 of the panelists, Andrea Libresco, Lisa Merrill, and Tanika Smith. Why has the US not previously elected a woman as president? What do you think that have been the main historical obstacles? Have we by now overcome some of these obstacles? So starting with Andrea.
I'm going to let Lisa go first because her history part is a little further back.
All right. So then the second part of the question for the 3 of you, but beginning with historical process. If you can provide some historical background on women and the vote in the United States, and what was the early history of black women organizing to vote, and what lessons can we learn from this for the present?
Okay, thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here with my colleagues and with all of you. I teach a course on race and gender and the struggle for the black woman's vote. So some of this comes out of that research. And the images that you saw at the very beginning really answer Benita's question. because we all stand on the shoulders of ancestors. And although I can talk about some of the 19th century activism for women's suffrage, and some of the Black women's sororities, particularly the Deltas, had a big hand in that. The organizing for the vote for Black women came out of churches and sororities and very different places where the material is there. But to answer this question, the shoulder of ancestors that we stand on, you saw two images that I put up there. The one you might recognize the most is Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972. I'm from Brooklyn, very proudly, and so was she, and she was the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968. I have to say this year is 100 years since she was born. She was born in 1924. And in 1972, she ran for president of the United States. So she was the first woman. I've staged these encounters on campus, but she was the first woman who ran for president with a major party ticket. And her slogan that you saw, unbought and unbossed, was really an important part. And one of the things she said, because of all the racism and sexism that she experienced, in answer to Benita's good question, Chisholm's most famous quote is, "If they won't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." And so she was encouraging women to be activists. She had her own immigration history, family from Guyana and Barbados, and a big part of the Caribbean community. The other image that I want to think about in terms of what some of the restrictions were for women, not just running for political office, but as voters. And since we're all faced with an election very soon, this is close to my heart and I'm sure to many of yours, you may not have recognized the other Black woman in the slide, and that was Fannie Lou Hamer, who was an amazing activist and someone who grew up in poverty, worked in cotton fields. She was born in 1917, the 20th child of sharecroppers. She did not know until 1962 that Black people could vote in this country. So even though we can talk about the dates that voting was possible, the lack of information and access and incredible voter suppression that particularly people of color experienced is, I think, a big answer to that. So again, then just briefly, because I know Andrea has a lot to say too, when Fannie Lou Hamer found out that women could vote, she was also influenced to be a member of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1962 and 63. And at SNCC, she worked on voter registration and was horribly attacked. So just think about, we're not just standing on the shoulders of these activists, but people like Hamer risked their lives. She was almost killed. She had been shot. She was arrested by police for trying to do voter registration. She was so badly, as were other women with her, so brutally beaten over 4 terrifying days that she had severe injuries to her eyes, legs, kidneys that affected her for the rest of her life. And she continued to be an activist. So anytime somebody says to me, oh, I'm not going to vote, I think about these women and the incredible risk and courage that it took to do that. So in honoring them, hopefully you guys, if you haven't already, there's early voting, will vote. But I think the resistance is voter suppression. Mm-hmm. It's an intentional not making available information. Mm-hmm. Certainly it's the fact that women could legally vote till 1920 in the United States. But for Black women, for Latinas, for Native women, even knowing that voting was possible was a much later event. And when they tried to vote, like Hamer, there's beautiful documentation of her that you can find online, her powerful speeches and song to get people to vote, people who worked so hard. So I think that sense of the courage it takes to deal with voter suppression, to let people know what was at stake. And if you think that your vote doesn't matter, it's not an accident. Somebody wants you to think that. So please, let's honor those. And I know Andrea has much more recent examples for us.
Yeah. So I would thank you, by the way. By the way, Election Day, 3 weeks from today, as we think about the people who have given their lives and their bodies. So I wanted to do a little bit about history as well, including some personal history. I'll sort of weave the two together because I do think the personal is political. So when I was a kid in elementary school, girls weren't allowed to wear pants, even though I grew up in Connecticut and it was cold. Our teams had no uniforms, and we got practice spaces when the boys were done. So I was really thrilled in 1984 when Walter Mondale chose Jerry Ferraro as the vice presidential candidate. She was the first woman on a major party ticket, even though I knew he chose her as kind of a Hail Mary because he was going to lose big, and he did, to the incumbent Ronald Reagan. Reporters had no idea how to cover her. There were multiple articles written about what she should do with her purse when she was speaking at the podium. 4 years later, Pat Schroeder, who's a representative from Colorado, formed an exploratory committee to decide whether or not she should run for president in the 1988 race on the Democratic primary side. And she was the first woman to try since Shirley Chisholm, whom you just heard about. In her first campaign for Congress in 1972, Pat Schroeder was asked, "How can you be a mother and a congresswoman?" And she replied, "I have a brain and a uterus, and I use both." And actually, because you said the thing about sitting with a chair, I am also reminded of a true story about Pat Schroeder. She was put on the Armed Services Committee, and she was first woman on the Armed Services Committee, which is not the norm that women would end up on the Armed Services Committee in those days. They'd be put on some soft committee, whatever that means. And Ron Dellums was on the same committee, and he was a black man on the Armed Services Committee. And the chair of the committee, and I want to say his name out loud, Representative Edward Herbert, a conservative Louisiana Democrat, and it had been the all-male and all-white Armed Services Committee. And at their first committee meeting in 1973, he made Ms. Schroeder sit in the same chair with Representative Ron Dellums, an African-American, and she said, as she recounted it in her book, she and Mr. Dellums had to sit cheek to cheek because the chairman said that women and blacks were worth only half of one regular member. It's good to have the context, I think, always. Pat Schroeder decided not to run for president, and in her speech announcing that decision, she got a bit teary, and she brought a tissue to her eye. That was the picture that was taken. Guess what every newspaper led with? So here's the personal. This was when I got my first letter published in Newsday, because I was really outraged that that was the story, was that she cried when she left. I was quite disgusted. So there was a media frenzy around this, and what's interesting is who critiqued her. So conservative critics displayed, it said she displayed a dangerous emotionalism, and you've heard all variations on that over the years. Does somebody have their period? What's going to happen if we get invaded when somebody's got their period? How's that going to go? But a number of female columnists said she had ruined the chance for any woman to run for president for the rest of the century. And Pat Schroeder did not let them have the last word on that. She said, she was a real wordsmith, she said, "I think it's amazing that no one ever said that Joe Biden had ruined the future of men forever because people would think that they all plagiarized, or that Gary Hart ruined the future of men forever because they all played around." Fast forward to 2008, when Hillary Clinton was the primary candidate against Barack Obama. She was thought of at that time, compared to him, who was loose and cool, as too programmed and too assertive for a woman. And after losing the Iowa caucuses to Barack Obama in January, she teared up at a New Hampshire diner when asked about the personal toil of running a national race. Now, critics of her thought that tearing up was calculated. She teared up on purpose to make her look human. Incredible. But many voters did find it humanizing. I have to say that if I had been Hillary running in that race and had men coming to every rally yelling out, "Iron my shirt," which they did, it's documented, and one of the books that's documented is Big Girls Don't Cry by Rebecca Traister. And much worse, of course. I'd be emotional too. She went on to win the New Hampshire primary, not the nomination, obviously. Interestingly, before the diner moment, she had said, if you get too emotional, that undercuts you. A man can cry, but a woman, that's a different kind of dynamic. So I focused on these crying episodes, but not because that's the whole story. But I think what they do is raise larger questions for all of us as we think about gender identity and politics, a few of which I'll just mention now, and then I'll cede my time. So what are the emotional valences that women running for office are allowed to display? Can they be joyful? Can they be angry, tearful, caring, highly intelligent, tough? Does the narrow range of emotions that we allow women track with policy? In other words, are women office holders more likely to support issues that women care about, like Pat Schroeder's legislation on family leave and pregnancy discrimination? Or do they avoid those issues at times? Do they stake out tougher positions on foreign policy to show they can be as strong as men, a la Hillary Clinton? And then we can think about where Kamala Harris fits into that. How important are these emotional valences as opposed to policy positions to potential voters? How far has the public really come? And I'll give Pat Schroeder the last word on this. She said that the question she was trying to answer with her possible run was, is America man enough to back a woman? So clearly the answer in 1988 was no. And we'll find out in 3 weeks, probably not in 3 weeks, it's gonna be endless, but we'll find out at some point what it'll be in 2024. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa and Andrea. I think Tanika wants to add something on this relationship between women and the election in a historical perspective.
Yes, just something pretty brief. I wanted to point out the gender bias and stereotypes that typically plague Black women, especially Black women in this country. For example, even when Michelle Obama was, she wasn't in office per se as a president, but she was portrayed as a monkey amongst most. And then even Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, how she's portrayed very sexualized. And that has been a common thread in the United States, how these gender biases and stereotypes typically color how people view women in general, but Black women in particular. So that's all I wanted to add. Everything else I agree with.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, you have already touched on the issue of media and coverage, right, of the candidates, and we are going to go back to that in the last portion of the questions. Now, for the second part, on the obstacles that women face in politics, right, in the United States in general, but especially when running for the presidency. And these two questions are particularly aimed for Tricia and Tomika. Yeah. So is identity politics a liability in national elections? How do intersectional identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, national ancestry, or disability affect political engagement and voting behavior, right? On that first question.
I can go first. Thank you. So for myself, I'd like to think about, what does identity politics mean? So when I think of identity politics, it's the tendency for people or a particular group, whether it's ethnic or gender, to align politically. So for myself, just so everyone knows, I consider myself a proud, educated African-American woman, right? And so with that, it would suggest that I would, align with a candidate who looks like me. But I think the liability is in the fact that one can have tunnel vision and only using that lens to identify a particular candidate and not looking at the totality of their politics and seeing if those politics or policies really can help you with your life in an everyday course. I'll say for myself personally, I know that the intersectionality, which was the other part of that question, became an issue for me in the 2008 election, especially when, as you had mentioned earlier, that President Barack Obama was, going against Hillary Clinton, because it intersected both myself, gender as a woman, but also my race as an African American person. Which person would I actually identify most with, based on the identity of politics of me being an intersection of a woman and an African American person. And then if I identify with one way, then I have to publicly say that to other people. How am I comfortable with doing that? I'm not sure how that's going to really play out for myself. And so that's where it became a discussion, within myself and of course within my family, because we're a type of family that talks about the political climate and current events to really determine what was best for us during that time period. So to answer your question succinctly, the liability is having that tunnel vision and only looking at someone who looks like yourself. There's an expression where, not all folks are kinfolk, meaning that not everybody who looks like you is for you. And so I always want to stress for people, always look at the total picture of who that person is politically and not just how they look, like you.
I'm going to hit the first part of Dr. San Pedro's question about the media coverage and the way in which media frames it. And it becomes more interesting when you look at the multiple intersections, as multiple of my colleagues have already pointed to, of how exactly do you cover a female candidate, especially when you're looking at a national election. Even on the local and state level, there's often that conversation, as Tricia just pointed out, about, this is a woman, so clearly they only focus on women's issues, or they only care about those things like childcare, education, those particular issues. And as Andrea said, there's also that positioning of, well, do I need to assert myself as a female candidate to be tougher in those arenas that are considered more masculine in order to be taken seriously? But the media helps to shape that conversation of what are they asking? What are the questions? How are they discussing those particular moments of those candidates? So I think back to 2008, since Andrea brought this up. In 2008, primary elections, I was in the position, I was in grad school, I was working for former President H.W. Bush, and very much so deep into the Republican primary parts, but watching the ways in which the conversations about that emotionality of then primary candidate Clinton, and then even seeing it fast forward to when she did become the primary candidate in 2016, there was entire articles about the color of her pantsuits. Do we pay attention to the fashion choices of male candidates? No, but there was continuous coverage of, is this too masculine? Or should we not take her seriously because she has all these Skittle-colored suits and those particular things, to where it's not just about the framing of the emotion, because that's certainly a part of it. No, women are not allowed to cry. They're not allowed to laugh either, because Kamala Harris is being framed as the cackler, as well as a hoe in several different spaces, because that also, we'll get to that intersection of how women of color are framed in a little bit in a second. But they're not allowed to be any of those things. They need to just be whatever we need them to be in that moment. And the ways in which not just our conversation about who we vote for, but the ways in which our coverage shapes those questions, and the ways in which they shape the framing of it is exceptionally important, and it does have an impact on what we see and how we view the lens in which we do view each of those candidates. I said I would come back to, for a second, this framing, because as both Tanika and Lisa pointed out a little bit earlier, the framing of women of color in particular is even more complicated when you consider those intersections, to where women of color, whether it's Black women, Latino women, or Native women, have historically been framed as being hypersexualized and being the only way they can possibly be successful is if they slept their way to the top. And we're seeing that play out with Kamala Harris in that lots of, including media outlets, have called her a hoe and said that she went through these lengths to get to where she is, not looking at her education, not looking at her voting records, not looking at her time as a defender, as a prosecutor, her time as a congressperson. It's literally just looking at, she's a woman, and she's a woman of color, so clearly she had to have slept her way to the top. So there's where that intersection becomes even more interesting. And with Kamala Harris, there's also this, as Tricia pointed out, the like, who do we frame it as? She's also a mixed race woman. To where she has to pick a box. We cannot possibly imagine a frame in the United States of America of people being mixed race. Pretty much everybody in this room is probably mixed in some way. Do your 23andMe or Ancestry stuff. You'll figure out that there's some mixing that is happening. But there's the framing of she has to be just a black woman. She has to be just a Asian woman. She has to just be one of those in order for us to know where she stands. And then when you throw in the nationality parts of it, to where you talk about where her family derives from, it's reminiscent to where when Barack Obama was running about the birther stuff. And it's kind of interesting that you have the same person who started the birther arguments who's also going after another candidate about their ancestry, as if that matters on whether or not they are fit for the office. So the obstacles to women is that it creates more conversation about things outside of the policies, outside of the things that really should matter, because we have to spend so much time weeding through all of this extra stuff in order to get to the policy, to where some people stop just here and they don't get into the other parts.
Can I add one point to that?
Yes, exactly.
So when you mentioned the pantsuits, one thing that occurred to me, the person we haven't mentioned in this at the moment is Sarah Palin,
Yes.
who, for those of you in the audience who are youthful, she ended up being John McCain's vice presidential pick in 2008, and for some Republicans, she was the sort of answer to what a woman should be, because she had a family, she was in politics, she was governor of Alaska at that point, and although she juggled those things, she was not in favor of more money on health care, child care, labor issues, so when you talk about policy versus who you are, so she's a white woman who isn't voting for issues that would help her and her family. But my pantsuit point is this. She wore skirts and suits and had a hot little figure, and was dressed to emphasize, because she received all the clothing all of a sudden and was dressed to emphasize her hot little figure. And in fact, that's what was discussed on television. And one of the commentators, Donnie Deutsch, who is still on MSNBC today, which is a liberal-leaning station, talked about how great it was that she could do all this stuff with her family, all while wearing a skirt. And he said, it's a new creation of the old feminist ideal. I want her watching my kids. I want her laying next to me in bed. On TV, on MSNBC. Anyway. Just had to add that in.
That was a great point.
Do you want to add something?
Well, the only thing that I would add is, and I love what you stated, because that's exactly what I think about when I think about intersectionality in women. But one other thing, as it relates to women of color, the angry black women, or the angry black woman, why can't we be assertive? As opposed, and when it's compared to a man, he's assertive. He articulates himself well. But if you are assertive, you're considered an angry black woman. That really shapes the way people view women, and particularly women of color, as you were stating.
Great, thank you. So moving into the third section, right, of the questions, and this is kind of addressed to everyone at the table. What steps do you think are necessary to create an environment where more women are contenders for high political office, including the presidency?
One thing is people need to vote down ballot. The Senate decides the Supreme Court. The president picks and the Senate approves. And in people's lifetimes in this room, that former President Trump appointed 3 justices, but with the help of Mitch McConnell in the Senate, because Mitch McConnell was the majority leader. That matters. So that's one thing that for all those who are voters in this room, and I hope that includes everyone, 3 weeks from today, don't just be voting for the top of the ticket. You have to vote down, but not just down on House and Senate. The pipeline for people to go into politics is much further on down the ballot. People really need to get in at local offices and move up as well. And I think that happened in a big way, actually, after the Trump election, after the big Women's March in Washington and other places around the world. I think there were a lot of women who decided they would get involved. But the trick is to stay involved. There's a lot of barriers that keep you from being involved, and they go to issues that are votable issues, like childcare, like healthcare. So down ballot matters.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that I completely agree with Dr. Labresco, is that we definitely need to think about who's in your local offices and think about running for local offices, to where a lot of people just focus on politics from the top of the ticket and like the age barriers and stuff like that. Running for school board, running for mayor even, the barriers are a lot lower, including fundraising barriers and stuff, especially if you're in a smaller locality or in spaces where it's uncontested often of who is running for that. It's just kind of assumed that whoever the incumbent is, they're going to get reelected because no one has challenged them. To where getting involved at a local level, so volunteering at political offices, going and talking to whichever party your interests align with, and talking to them about, how can I get involved? Starting to get that shaping into how do you run for a school board position, and why does a school board position matter? You've seen on the national level, while it matters, book bans, those types of things, all of that started in the local school districts and expanded out. So really getting involved now and starting to figure out how even why it matters to volunteer as a pollster, why it matters to get involved with, like on our campus, the Hofstra Votes campaign, or even with our School of Comm, with the wonderful coverage that they do. Getting involved with those things are ways in which to get your foot in the door, and it's a way for you to start to learn how do these political processes and offices work. And if you have an interest, run. You never know whether or not you're going to be elected. If you're not elected in that election, you've learned a lot from the process, and you might get even more support in future. So beyond just voting, it's also figuring out if you have the appetite for it, if there's something that you are passionate about, run.
So I underscore all the good things my friends and colleagues here have said. Just to remind you about two of the women that I mentioned, and it just supports what Dr. Robinson just said too. As I said, Shirley Chisholm started out as a congressperson, but even Fannie Lou Hamer, who was almost killed for trying to register people to vote, in 1965 didn't succeed, but announced her candidacy for the Mississippi House of Representatives to challenge a white segregationist. The Democratic Party at the time didn't allow her on the official ballot, but 60,000 black voters wrote in her name on what were called freedom ballots. And so part of the activism that Dean Robinson is talking about in terms of making sure that people vote, that people register to vote, and then decide whatever kinds of candidacy really speaks to them. But your involvement in all of that starts, I was so glad to hear you all say that, not just at the top, but learning both what you might want to run for, but also to be part of the whole system. And it's so great that we have Hofstra Votes here. because I give my students extra credit for registering people to vote. And vote for whoever you want, but it's exercising your political voice. And know how hard that was, because there is so much voter suppression. One of the people who most influences me in the past couple of elections is Stacey Abrams, who has spoken so eloquently about the ways that she was gerrymandered out of being governor and how much voter suppression really has affected her. But she's turned a lot of it around. So that's part of what I think really needs to happen.
Okay.
Just one point on
Yes.
Stacey Abrams, because she brings up another point, a general point, which is she's really active in between elections. So it's not just about voting up ballot and down ballot. It's being active throughout. And being active can be directed toward the media. If you don't like how they're portraying women on TV, you write them and tell them. They don't hear from that many people all the time. So your voice makes a difference. School boards don't hear from that many people most of the time. Some issues generate. So you have that power of response no matter what.
Great. The next question then, and this again, it's for everyone at the table, right? In your opinion, what is the most important issue on the ballot for women other than healthcare? And I say other than healthcare because healthcare is the last of the questions that we want to cover at the table. And I know we have several experts here in the table. So what are the pivotal issues on the ballot other than healthcare?
Other than healthcare.
Okay, you.
Well, there's a few. So one of the ones in which the Harris campaign has been quite interesting in getting the messaging out is discussing the cost of childcare. To where, while yes, that's one of those, it feels like a low-hanging fruit for a woman to talk about childcare, she's also a woman who doesn't have any biological children, which is a part of the conversation too, to where she's not coming from it from a, I know personally how much childcare costs. Again, that's an intersection that comes in that makes her framing of the conversation a little bit more interesting and nuanced. It is an economic issue, to where people cannot afford to be a part of the workforce and care for their children, or they cannot afford, like the cost of childcare and stuff like that is astronomical. I'm a new mom, trust me, I know. As we think about like how things are played out, it's something that touches and resonates across party lines. It's something that resonates across demographics, to where people are men and women, non-binary people, transgender people. Everyone is considering the cost of it if you are thinking about family planning or family care at some point. So thinking about the tax credits and stuff for childcare and really talking about, hey, the tax credit is going to be $6,000 to people, that's a conversation starter. Now, whether the conversation is whether or not that's politically feasible, whether or not that is something that is affordable, it is still a conversation starter. So that is one of the issues that I think that certainly has been dealt with quite a bit. And then we'll come back to the reproductive justice issue in a moment, but that is another issue that I think that voters are paying attention to.
I think one of the things we've already been talking about, the overt and implicit racism that is the undercurrent of this current campaign and the homophobia, I think are the issues that are just out there. It's, I love Fannie Lou Hamer said, your freedom is shackled in chains to mine. Until I am free, you're not free either. And until people realize that, I think we're in big trouble. But the implicit racism in some of the appeals of, one of the candidates is so much a part. It's not just dog whistles anymore. It's overt. It's absolutely overt racist acknowledgement of those policies. And I think, again, for people who think, oh, well, the two parties aren't that different, just look at what they're saying, I think that this is really the heart, in addition to, of course, the importance of healthcare. That's what's going on now.
And I know healthcare is a huge issue, and I'd like to discuss that a little more, but I think housing is a huge issue at this time. Who can afford housing? How can you get housing? Housing instability is huge in our country, and a lot of people, young people in particular, are having issues that they're going to be faced with in terms of housing and how instability. And so I think housing is very big on this ticket and something that we need to be paying attention to.
And I would just add that, so all of those issues aren't always put in the frame of what's the most important issue for women, right? I mean, so part of the balancing act for a candidate who is female or who isn't a white male, I can put it more that way, is to think of what is the way to frame the issue that attracts everyone, you know, that and it's come down to sort of the economy, and that goes all the way back to Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid, but it does, right? I mean the big framing device. However, I'm going to say one other thing, which is the issue that isn't talked about so overtly that does affect everybody, including women, is climate change. It's the existential issue of our time. And here we are living through Hurricane Milton and the hurricane that wiped Helene, that wiped out Asheville, and the fires in California, and you name it. That's a woman's issue. That's a human issue. That's a world issue. It's hard to get people excited, though, about some issues.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
Yes. What about the issue of migration?
I was going to jump in and say that was another one. And what makes it even more interesting for both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, they're both children of immigrants. To where how they're framing the conversation about immigration and who's coming in and who's the threat has been also very interesting to watch, to where it's not a gendered issue, but it certainly is a political issue, and it does impact, as Andrea said, all this stuff impacts all of us, whether we're men, women, non-binary, it doesn't matter. It all impacts us. But immigration is one of those things, and you see in all of that, you saw in the debate, that every talking point was like, well, I'm going to come back to immigration. I'm going to come back to the economy, regardless of what the question was, because that is something that people are concerned about, and thinking about its impact on their jobs, their mobility, everything else, and then the continued framing of the dangerous, dirty immigrant. That's an old playbook. That's nothing new. It's something that has happened to almost every immigrant group within the United States, as they are the dirty people who are eating strange things. Oh no, we should be afraid always of it, to where we've seen that play out on the political stage too.
But that goes back to framing, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's framing when you think of, there was just a piece in the New York Times by Susan Faludi, who wrote about backlash years ago. And she talked about the word protection, because Donald Trump has said, I am your protector to women. Think about that. But Susan Faludi was arguing, well, what does protection mean? If you're pragmatic and thinking about foreign policy in a protecting kind of way, you're protecting the people in your country and the people in the world. And with immigration, what does protection mean? You know, protection from whom, for whom. But that requires framing to which audiences where. It's challenging. It's challenging to be a candidate.
And you're seeing that play out I don't know how many people are paying attention to what's happening in Michigan right now. The campaigning that is specifically targeted to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in particular in those spaces, it is that framing of who best represents your issues. And both parties are there saying that they best represent their issues and constituencies. And there are some people who are, especially against Donald Trump, they're arguing, hey, remember that Muslim ban thing? I was actually caught in the Muslim ban, the first iteration of it at JFK. That was fun. They're like, hey, He doesn't represent you. Remember, he wanted to ban all of you at some point, but there's that reframing of the messaging. But I represent you better and I protect you better than this other candidate that's out there.
I love the way Michelle Obama responded about one of those black jobs, because you remember that former President Trump, right, said, you know, in an attempt to use racism as an argument against immigration, that your jobs are going to be taken away.
Yeah.
And so, you know, let the presidency be one of those black jobs.
Exactly. All right, so we enter into the last question, and I know that some of you, right, Tricia and Tamika, are anxious to talk about this issue. So the healthcare issue, and really what is at stake for women, right, with the healthcare issue.
Yes. Okay, so for myself, you know, as a person, as I said, I identify as an African-American woman, I feel like within the media right now, I feel like healthcare is not one of the things that are most readily talked about, and which it should be, just for the, you know, for everyone who's been around since, 2020, just go for COVID. Right? So I feel like COVID was that thing where healthcare is sort of similar like insurance. You don't know you need it until you realize it can be taken away, and it's something that, you need on a daily basis in order to live. And I feel like for myself within this, this political round, both candidates have not necessarily talked enough about the healthcare issues that could affect your day-to-day living. One of the things that I've seen is that within the West Health and Gallup poll, there was a recent poll that was published on October 4th of this year that said 60% of Americans are not paying enough attention to the healthcare within this polling season. So I would hearken everybody to get, involved in having to vote within the next 3 weeks, but also be aware of what the politicians are thinking about healthcare as it relates to your own personal life.
While they're not talking about healthcare from a holistic standpoint,
True.
they are talking about reproductive justice.
Right.
Yes.
And we've seen that with the striking down of Roe v. Wade, women have mobilized, especially suburban white women have mobilized in a way that we hadn't seen in quite some time, and really saying who is best situated to protect my choice to do what I need to do with my body without the government telling us what to do, to where we are seeing that conversation playing out on the national stage between those candidates and between the parties and stuff about, what is actually at stake. And you do have some key Republicans, I want to be fair, like Nikki Haley and others, saying completely banning abortion is stupid. And Republicans need to back away from that language because it's not a winnable language. We've seen down ballot of lots of congressional looking at policies in states that have put reproductive justice on the ballot, those candidates have lost. The women are showing up and saying, no, back away from reproductive justice issues, because abortion is health care, and it is something that women should have the right to discuss with their doctors and everything else. And I don't know how many of you came to the reproductive justice panel a few weeks ago, but we talked a lot about that. Dr. Merrill and I were both on that panel, talked a lot about why that matters and why specifically in this political campaign it matters. So you're definitely seeing a lot of conversation and stuff around that. It's not the sole healthcare issue. I wish that people were talking more about expanding the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and how to get that implemented in better ways and stuff. And there is some talk about that too, but more in the frame of we need to get rid of it, because if you don't have access, you don't have choices of your doctor and stuff, even though we know that was never actually the case, and that everyone has benefited from that legislation known as Obamacare, but the actual one is patient protection and affordable care.
Yeah.
And I would say that I think that people are concerned about the high cost of healthcare in general. I have patients that come to me that are not able to afford seeing me, and we try, because I work in a lower income community and we do sliding scales, or sometimes we have to allow patients to just be seen without any insurance, or we have the immigrant population that some people are undocumented and they don't have insurance. So healthcare and the cost of healthcare is a big issue that I would like to see be addressed more from the candidates, both candidates, really, paying attention to that. The other thing that it's very concerning and disheartening is health equality is not fair amongst all, right? There is not equitable. Everybody's not receiving the same care. They may not be able to afford the care. They may not have transportation issues to receiving care. And a big issue that I'm concerned about now is maternal morbidity and mortality, especially severe maternal mortality among Black birthing people, right? And so that's a big concern that I think needs to be addressed, because we have social determinants of health that are also impacting folks in terms of, whether they have a lower income status, whether there's structural racism that is influencing the way they receive care by their providers, by the community in which they live, and so on and so forth. We have historical issues that are still we're contending with in this country that is affecting health care. So these are some of the issues that need to be focused on and addressed in this.
And this is the first presidential election since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And this is the first election then that for Democrats, 22% of people who are single-issue voters are voting on abortion. It used to be the reverse, that in elections when Roe v. Wade was there would be anti-abortion voters who were single-issue voters. And there still are, of course, but this is the first time that's been a salient, high-valence issue for Democrats. And again, check down the ballot. In New York State, we have something called Proposition 1. I'm just seeing signs up about it now all around. And one week from tomorrow, on Day of Dialogue, there's a session in the evening from 6 o'clock to 7:30 about Prop 1, which is an equal rights kind of amendment for New York State that includes the issue of abortion, even though it doesn't use the word abortion. So you always have to read those carefully.
Yeah.
One thing I just want to add before we get to, because I know we need to get to our closing, is also watch what media you're consuming, especially when we say the framing are saying that things aren't being covered because that the candidates aren't discussing them. They are. They just may not be getting the coverage that will get it out to you, because absolutely, like the Harris campaign has talked about maternal mortality. In fact, she held a town hall with Black women doctors to talk about maternal mortality, especially with a lot of physicians in the Atlanta area, which has the highest Black maternal mortality rates in the U.S., to where they're talking about it, but it's not getting the coverage on mainstream media in the ways that some of the other issues are.
But I think that speaks to a broader problem that we have in this country, why that is not getting and the attention that it needs to. But yes, to your point, Kamala Harris has been speaking about maternal mortality and maternal morbidity, so that's great. And I think that it's so important to think about reproductive health even at this time. It not only is abortion on the ticket, also your contraceptions are on the ticket, also IVF is on the ticket. Like it's more than just this. It's like she said, reproductive justice, period, is on the ballot.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that, because that sense of reproductive rights mean your life is at stake, or the life of someone that you know is at stake. My dear niece had a miscarriage a couple of months ago and lives in a state where she had to almost die before she could get the medical care that is a routine DNC. That could be anybody who is female and has female reproductive organs in this room, or anybody that you know and care about. So think about your life being at stake with those issues.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for addressing all these questions. I will ask now all the panelists for very brief closing remarks, starting with Lisa and following.
Do you think we should just do questions?
I think we can do questions.
Let's just do questions. Is that okay?
Because we have time
Yeah.
for like 5.
Are you okay with
All
that?
right.
So, yeah, I agree.
Get to ask things.
We have 15 minutes. So
Yeah. Let's get some questions.
Let's do questions.
all
Then
right.
we'll do closing.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
All right. So questions?
now you got to get up there.
Come on.
Yes.
Yes,
Come to the mic.
So
Well, I mean, I saw a hand.
we're going to need to use the microphone, so if you can come up so everyone can hear. And students, we do give preference to students.
I'm not a student.
Oh, but
That's okay. You
Well,
can
you
start
can
us.
ask the question.
You can start.
I'm a
us.
teacher over in Uniondale, and I was just my question was how can we like really encourage women, especially those that don't speak English, and this is where the intersectionality really comes into play. And if they can't vote, like how are ways that they can really express themselves, especially in like our school community and things like that, so we can bring people out more.
So there are a lot of incredible organizations. So I think of like Voto Latino and a few other like organizations that are all about mobilizing and all about getting information to populations and stuff, to where social media is a great way to get a lot of that information, but it's who you follow and who you engage with. But there are a lot of wonderful nonprofit organizations that are really working on mobilizing and getting information, not just at the top, but also looking at some of those localized districts and stuff, to where there are local chapters of different organizations and stuff that are all over. I'll speak of one of the Long Island ones. That this one is not specifically to just one demographic, but LICARP. So that is the organization that Aisha is actually a part of, and it's really looking at school districts and stuff, and like who's like what candidates are actually looking at issues that impact Black and Brown students on Long Island in particular. So there's lots of organizations, just finding them, and I know that it's difficult sometimes to find them, but it's out there. Do a Google search and stuff. I hate to say that, but doing a Google search sometimes will get you some of those organizations, and then going to those meetings, meeting up with them, and really seeing some of the stuff. I got involved through LICARP with Aisha of even screening candidates, where I was like, I don't know who's running for any of these districts. Let me figure out what they are standing for school districts. And it was a pretty incredible experience.
Or just like grassroots organizations where they have boots on the ground, registering people to vote, even if they themselves can't, but you can help people too. So you can always do something that's politically active that you are engaging in your community.
Thank you.
And thank you for the question. We love members of the community in our events as well. Thank you. Students, please. Anyone from the audience? Any question?
They're all shy.
And it could be a comment,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
in case you don't have a question formulated.
Yeah.
Sure.
I know. Sure.
Love your shirt.
I just wanted you guys to see my shirt. I have a question. It's really general. What would you say to someone who is not planning to vote? I find this conversation very troubling, but what would you personally say to someone who says, I don't want to go to this side, I don't believe in that side, I'm just not going to vote?
I think knowing the people who lost their lives or risked their lives so that someone could vote. I really think, sometimes we think of history as a progress narrative, and it's not, because we see, like, losing Roe, certainly Reconstruction. Unless we constantly are aware of taking, of what rights are possible, we lose them. And I think that sense of just sharing with people, do you know who risked their lives so that you could vote? And if you don't vote, who wants you not to? Who wants you to sit home and think, oh, it doesn't matter, there's no difference, my voice doesn't matter? Somebody's going to benefit from that, and it won't be you. So that's what I always say, is whose interest is it?
I also think you have to have a longer conversation
Yeah.
with that person, because that's not a quick conversation.
Right.
So you have to find out, I think, what issues are of interest to them, what issues are affecting their lives at that moment, what issues affect their families' lives. And then you can go to the internet and reputable sites and look at the contrast between the candidates on those issues. I think that's an important piece of what it is. But it has to come from what you're listening to them, I think, more than anything.
And also, like, stressing the fact that the lack of voting is a vote.
right.
which is not,
Absolutely.
which
That is true.
right, which you're saying that you're not voting, but you are
voting.
in a sense.
That's
So you might as well take a stance and
love
vote
that.
on one side.
That's right.
I think that there is a little bit also of knowing your audience, and this
I was
kind of
gonna say
speaks
that, yeah.
to what Andrea is saying, like knowing what's going to appeal to them, because some people are going to be swayed by emotion and like, yes, talking about, you know, here are the people who you are letting down if you don't vote. Some people are going to be swayed by facts and figures, but knowing who they are and what is going to be important to them, not just issues, but also what appeal is going to work for them. Is it that pathos appeal to where it's very emotion laden? Is it that logos appeal to where it's like, nope, give me the numbers. This is what's going to make sense to me. Or is it a combination of the two? Or your relationship with them is going to determine how you approach that conversation. And it's there's not a one size fits all. It really is a longer conversation, but also your relationship with that person on whether or not you are the person who's going to be able to persuade them, or if they're even persuadable.
And just so I can add to Dr. Robinson's point, because I've had that conversation with a lot of my younger relatives, because they're looking at me like, okay, but I don't see the point. And so to Dr. Robinson's point, I had to appeal to them first from an emotional standpoint, and then it was like, okay, well, you know, you're not that far away from a generation where you weren't even able to vote. So you're disrespecting, disrespecting me by actually not being registered to vote. And so that's how, I enter the conversation, having to look at, an emotional standpoint, but also having that relationship to, figure out what would be the thing that gets them to register and then do the actual voting.
And in fact, when Barack Obama ran, people walked into the voting booth with pictures of their grandparents,
That's right.
you know, because they wanted them there for the vote.
Yeah.
So
Yes,
that's an important piece too.
Great.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for coming here today. And what I want to is more of a comment, not really a question, is kind of what you guys have all been talking about is that's about fall. Is about if people aren't planning to vote, that is a vote in itself, like abstaining to vote. And then if you don't know who to choose because like you see both of them as horrible choices, it's also about voting for others and for those who can't vote or those like either can't vote because of certain circumstances or they just aren't able to get a mail-in ballot or they can't actually go physically to vote. Voting for them is what matters, and especially like especially on college campuses where there's a lot of students that aren't local. Like I live in North Carolina, which is a big swing state right now, and I ordered my mail-in ballot and I'm planning to vote, and I know who I'm voting for now. Like it was I was thinking about like other issues, not between like blue and red, it was between blue and green, but now I know who I'm voting for, and I'm voting to because it's a swing state and there's strength in numbers, and if I vote in a way that I think will help other people the most and help those especially those disenfranchised in America, then I am gonna do everything I can to do that. And I just
Great comment.
Very good.
I'd also add, though, that people who say it's a choice between two horribles or it's a horrible choice, those are low information voters.
Yes.
I just want to say that publicly. And that's not to say you can't be on the side that I'm not on. Like, that's a clear choice, you know? So it's not about whom you're voting for in that regard. It's tarring both with the same brush, that's a low information voter. And there's pretty quick, easy fixes in an internet age to that problem.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to everyone on the panel for being here and for the office for organizing it and for my students for coming to listen to you. I'm only recently able to vote in the United States. And thank you. And it is true that it's very, I always know what the candidates are in the big ballot, and maybe for Senate, and maybe for Congress, but I have very little idea of what other positions are at stake. And it's not easy to follow either.
Yeah.
Like for this election, for example, where can students who are intending to vote and want to get engaged, not just in the top of the ballot, but bottom, like down the ballot, where can they find that information and to see what are the issues that they will be asked about when it comes down to submitting the ballot?
So I would again suggest getting online and figuring out where they are, like where their local district is. And, so because we have a lot of students who are from out of state and at all different townships and everything else, it's really like researching, here is my district, who's running, and then researching those candidates and those policies and everything else. And it takes a little bit of extra sleuthing. It's not going to just be a one-click type of thing, but certainly going deeper into it and having like, okay, I have a clear understanding of who's on the ballots, here's what they stand for, and here's what I believe in as far as casting the votes and stuff like that. It takes a little bit of extra work, but it's worth it because then it's informed voting and is not just getting into the ballot box and like, oh wait, I thought it was just this, because we also do know that a lot of people only fill out the top of the ballot and not the rest because they don't feel informed about it. So taking that extra step, knowing what your ballot is going to look for sample ballots, all of those things are online and they're accessible, but you do have to do a little bit of digging in order to find it.
So thank you very much. So for instance, if you find out what is your district, and then maybe you can do sample ballot for X district,
Yes. Yes,
that
you
might
can.
generate a result. That's great. Thank you very much.
And most local papers
newspapers.
print, even if it's kids and they're not looking at local papers in print, the local papers are online too, and they can put in the name of the local paper and put the two candidates in and say issues. And even if they trust their local paper, they can write endorsement and see who's been endorsed if they believe that.
And the propositions. I mean, for any New York voter, really look at the propositions and whatever your state is. There'll be propositions on the ballot, too, that are really important.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I just wanted to follow up in reference to first-time voters and not knowing who your local politicians are. Lately, well, not lately, but if you really look into your community, there's a lot of meet the candidates events that are happening, whether it's in your library, whether it's in your community center, whether it's in your churches or what have you. This gives you the opportunity to go to these events and actually meet face to face with some of the candidates and speak to them and ask you questions and find out what their beliefs are, what they're standing for, and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to bring that to the forefront.
Yeah, and paying attention to not just the candidates and stuff. I'm going to put Athleen on the spot for a second. She just posted, I just saw it because I don't live in the town of Hempstead, but there's a town hall talking about a 12.1% tax hike for the town of Hempstead. That impacts people who live in this district. So following people like Athleen, who also will post you about, inform you about stuff, is also important. Having politically engaged friends is what I'm really saying here. Yeah. To where even I don't live in the town of Hempstead, but I know what's happening in the town of Hempstead because of my politically engaged friends.
And again, it's because someone messaged me, and I also did a post on Facebook because 12.1%, I immediately went to Google to see what areas encompasses the town of Hempstead, and I'm like, are they crazy? And not only that, in the article it also mentioned that the elected officials get 14% raises, and they just voted that it will be automatic. We don't even get 2%. 14%, and what are they doing? We can't even afford groceries. Okay? Something is wrong. That's why it's very important for your local.
Agreed. Thank you. One last question then, yes.
Mine isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. So you talked earlier about how to get more women involved in politics. And as one of the political scientists, what I would say is teach young girls that that politics is a viable career. You know, when young girls at the age of 6 draw who is a politician, they're equally as likely to draw men and women. When you ask the same young girls at 15, they draw men because they've been politically socialized that men should be politicians. So. No real question.
Yes, I think that was a perfect closing for the table. And I want to thank all the panelists and, of course, the organizers, and thank everyone for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.